Have you ever been in a situation where you thought your life couldn't get any worse, only to discover that rock bottom was actually the foundation for something incredible? Well, that's exactly what happened to Clara Martinez on what was supposed to be the most humiliating night of her entire life. Picture this. You're a humble preschool teacher who's been convinced by your so-called friends to go on a blind date at the most expensive restaurant in town. You've spent your entire paycheck on a dress, you're sitting there waiting, and slowly it dawns on you that this isn't just a no-show. It's a setup. Your friends are actually filming your humiliation from across the restaurant, laughing as you realize you've been the punchline of a cruel joke all along. Most people would crawl under a rock and never show their face again, right? But sometimes the universe has bigger plans than our worst nightmares. Sometimes what looks like your lowest moment is actually the setup for the most extraordinary plot twist of your life. Because while Clara was sitting there, dying inside, she had no idea that her fairy tale was about to walk through those restaurant doors in the form of a mysterious stranger who would change everything. She couldn't have imagined that within months this same man would be declaring his love for her in front of the entire city. And she definitely couldn't have predicted that he'd end up proposing to her at a charity gala filled with the most powerful people in town. This is the story of how a woman's worst enemies accidentally gave her the greatest gift of her life. It's about what happens when genuine kindness meets unexpected wealth, when a broken family finds healing through an unlikely angel, and when the cruelest joke becomes the setup for the most beautiful love story. But most importantly, this is about what happens when you refuse to let other people's cruelty define your worth, and how the universe sometimes rewards that courage in ways you never saw coming. So buckle up, because Clara Martinez's journey from humiliated teacher to beloved wife is about to show you that sometimes your biggest breakdown leads to your most incredible breakthrough. You know that feeling when you're standing at the edge of something that could either make you or break you? That's exactly where Clara Martinez found herself on a Tuesday evening that would change everything. She wasn't the type to take big risks. Never had been, really. As a preschool teacher in a modest neighborhood, her life was predictable, safe, and honestly a little lonely. But sometimes life has this way of pushing you toward moments you'd never choose for yourself. Her so-called friends had been relentless for weeks. "Clara, you can't stay single forever," they'd say with those fake concerned voices that cut deeper than any honest criticism. "We found the perfect guy for you." The way Jessica's eyes lit up when she mentioned the blind date should have been Clara's first red flag. But when you've been eating dinner alone for the third consecutive year, even questionable opportunities start looking appealing. The restaurant they'd chosen wasn't just upscale. It was the kind of place where a single appetizer costs more than Clara's weekly grocery budget. Crystal chandeliers hung from impossibly high ceilings, and every surface seemed to gleam with the kind of wealth she'd only seen in movies. She'd spent her entire paycheck on a dress that still looked modest compared to what other women were wearing. Walking through those glass doors felt like stepping into a world where she'd never belong. What Clara didn't know, what she couldn't have imagined in her worst nightmares, was that there never was a date. The whole thing had been orchestrated as entertainment, a cruel joke that Jessica and her crew thought would be absolutely hilarious. They'd reserved a table near the bar where they could watch the show unfold, phones ready to capture every moment of Clara's humiliation. "Look at her," Jessica whispered loud enough for nearby tables to hear, sitting there like she actually thinks someone's coming. The group erupted in barely contained laughter, the kind that makes your stomach drop when you realize you're the punchline. Clara sat alone at table 12, checking her phone every 30 seconds, smoothing her dress, trying to ignore the growing awareness that something was very, very wrong. 20 minutes turned into 40. The waiter had approached 3 times, each visit more awkward than the last. Clara's cheeks burned with embarrassment as other diners began to stare. She could hear the whispers, feel the pitying glances. Her friends weren't even trying to hide their amusement anymore. Jessica was openly filming, probably planning to post it everywhere. That's when the energy in the room shifted completely, the kind of shift that happens when someone truly powerful walks into a space. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Heads turned. Even the waitstaff seemed to straighten up. Clara didn't look up at first. She was too busy staring at her hands, willing herself not to cry in public. Ethan Cole didn't plan to be at Romano's that night. Board meetings usually ran late, but his assistant had canceled his dinner, and he'd decided to grab something quick before heading home to Chloe. He'd built an empire worth billions. But single fatherhood had taught him that no amount of money could buy the thing he wanted most. Time that moved slower. Moments that lasted longer. He noticed the scene immediately. Years of reading boardrooms had made him expert at recognizing power dynamics, and what he saw made his jaw tighten. A young woman sitting alone, clearly distressed, while a group nearby treated her pain like a spectacle. He'd seen enough cruelty in corporate America to recognize it anywhere. But this felt more personal, more vicious. Clara finally looked up when a shadow fell across her table. The man standing there wasn't what she'd expected from her fictional date, but he was different. Tall, confident, wearing a suit that probably cost more than her car, but it was his eyes that caught her attention. They held a kindness that seemed completely at odds with his obvious wealth and power. "Clara?" His voice was deep, warm, with just a hint of concern. "I'm so sorry I'm late. Traffic was absolutely insane." He slid into the seat across from her with the ease of someone who'd never questioned whether he belonged anywhere. The confusion on Clara's face lasted maybe 3 seconds before understanding dawned. This stranger, this beautiful, expensive stranger, was offering her a lifeline. She could practically feel Jessica's shock from across the room. "Oh," she managed, it's perfectly fine." Ethan had saved countless companies from bankruptcy, negotiated deals worth hundreds of millions, but he'd never felt satisfaction quite like the moment he saw relief flood Clara's features. "I hope you haven't been waiting long," he continued smoothly, signaling the waiter with the kind of gesture that brought immediate, respectful service. For the next hour, something magical happened. What had started as a rescue mission became something neither of them had expected. Clara forgot about her humiliation, forgot about Jessica and her cruel friends who'd long since slunk away in defeat. Ethan found himself laughing genuinely for the first time in months, drawn to Clara's authenticity in a world full of people who only wanted something from him. They talked about books, about her students, about his daughter, who struggled to connect with people. Clara had no idea she was sitting across from one of the city's most powerful CEOs, and Ethan loved that she treated him like just a person. No agenda, no calculation, just honest conversation that made the expensive restaurant fade into background noise. But fairy tale moments don't last forever. As the evening wound down, reality began creeping back in. Ethan paid the check, a gesture so smooth Clara barely noticed it happening. They walked to the valet together, the city lights casting everything in warm gold. "Thank you," Clara said softly as they waited. "Not just for dinner, but for, you didn't have to do that." Ethan studied her face in the streetlight glow, something shifting in his chest that he didn't quite understand. "Actually," he said, "I think maybe I did." Their eyes met, and for a moment, the busy street around them seemed to disappear. He helped her into a taxi, watching until the taillights disappeared into traffic. Standing there on the sidewalk, Ethan Cole, a man who'd always known exactly what came next, had absolutely no idea that he'd just met the woman who would turn his carefully controlled world completely upside down. And somewhere across town, as Clara finally allowed herself to smile, she couldn't shake the feeling that her ordinary life had just taken an extraordinary turn. Have you ever noticed how the universe has this peculiar sense of timing? Just when you think you've filed away a memory as a beautiful one-time thing, life decides to shuffle the deck and deal you the most unexpected hand. That's exactly what happened 3 days after Clara's magical evening at Romano's. Monday mornings at Sunshine Preschool were usually predictable chaos. Tiny humans with big emotions, juice boxes, and enough energy to power a small city. Clara had always loved this controlled mayhem. Kids didn't care about your designer clothes or your bank account. They cared about whether you listened when they told you about their weekend adventures, whether you remembered that Tommy was afraid of the class hamster, or that little Sarah only ate the crusts of her sandwiches. Clara was setting up the art station when she heard Mrs. Patterson, the director, walking down the hallway with someone new. "And this is our 4-year-old classroom," she was saying in that overly bright voice she used for wealthy parents. "Miss Martinez has been with us for 3 years. The children absolutely adore her." Clara looked up from organizing the finger paints, and her world tilted completely off its axis. Standing in her doorway, looking just as shocked as she felt, was the mysterious man from the restaurant. the one who'd saved her from the most humiliating night of her life. The one she'd been replaying conversations with for 3 straight days. Ethan Cole had faced hostile takeovers, confronted corrupt board members, and stared down billionaire competitors without breaking a sweat. But seeing Clara Martinez arranging tiny paintbrushes in a sunny classroom made his heart race in ways that multi-million-dollar deals never had. She looked different here, more relaxed, more herself. Her hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she wore a simple dress covered by a paint-splattered apron that somehow made her more beautiful than any evening gown ever could. "Daddy?" The small voice beside him broke through his stunned silence. Chloe Cole was 4 years old and had inherited her father's sharp mind and her late mother's delicate features. But what she'd developed all on her own was an armor of wariness that broke Ethan's heart daily. Since losing her mother 2 years ago, Chloe had built walls that even child psychologists couldn't fully penetrate. Clara's professional instincts kicked in immediately, even as her pulse hammered against her throat. She knelt down to Chloe's eye level, something that years of teaching had made automatic. "Hi there, sweetheart. You must be our new student." Her voice was gentle, patient, carrying none of the awkwardness she felt about the situation. What happened next was something Ethan would replay in his mind for months afterward. Chloe, his daughter who barely spoke to adults she didn't know, who hid behind his legs at every social gathering, walked straight to Clara. No hesitation, no fear. She stopped right in front of her new teacher and whispered, "You have kind eyes." Clara's heart melted completely. She'd worked with hundreds of children, but something about this little girl's serious expression and careful words touched her deeply. "Thank you, Chloe. That's one of the nicest things anyone's ever said to me." She meant it too. After years of being overlooked, dismissed, or actively humiliated, having a child recognize kindness in her felt like the most precious gift. Ethan watched this interaction with growing amazement. Chloe hadn't voluntarily approached a stranger in 2 years. Her therapist had warned him that starting preschool might be challenging, that his daughter's social anxiety could make the transition difficult. But here she was, already drawn to Clara like a moth to the gentlest flame. "Mr." Clara stood up, extending her hand professionally even though her cheeks were burning with the memory of their evening together. "Cole," Ethan supplied, taking her hand and holding it perhaps a moment longer than strictly professional. "Ethan Cole, and you're Ms. Martinez." The way he said her name sent shivers down her spine, the same way it had at the restaurant when he'd pretended to be her date. Mrs. Patterson was beaming, completely oblivious to the undercurrents in the room. "Wonderful. I'll leave you to get acquainted, Mr. Cole. Pickup is at 3:30 sharp." She bustled away, leaving the three of them in a bubble of awkward tension and unexpected possibility. "Can I see the classroom?" Chloe asked, tugging gently on Clara's apron. It was the longest sentence Ethan had heard his daughter speak to a stranger in months. "Of course you can," Clara replied, grateful for the distraction. "What would you like to see first?" As she began showing Chloe around the colorful space, pointing out the reading corner with its soft cushions, the dramatic play area with tiny kitchen appliances, and the art station she'd been organizing, Ethan found himself seeing his daughter through Clara's eyes. Clara noticed things other adults missed. She saw how Chloe gravitated toward the quieter corners, how her eyes lit up at the shelf of picture books but stayed carefully distant from the louder toys. Most importantly, she gave Chloe space to explore at her own pace, offering gentle commentary without overwhelming her with questions or forced enthusiasm. "We have story time every morning after snack," Clara explained, settling into the tiny chair in the reading corner. "Would you like to hear what book we're reading this week?" When Chloe nodded eagerly, Clara picked up a well-worn copy of The Giving Tree and began to read in a voice that was both animated and soothing. Ethan leaned against the doorframe, watching his daughter's face transform. For the first time in months, Chloe looked genuinely engaged, genuinely happy. The tight knot of worry that lived permanently in his chest began to loosen just slightly. Maybe, just maybe, this school would be different. Maybe Clara would be different. When story time ended, Chloe surprised everyone by walking directly to Ethan and tugging on his expensive suit jacket. "Daddy, can I come back tomorrow?" The hope in her voice was so pure, so desperate, that Ethan would have moved mountains to make it happen. "Every day, sweetheart," he promised, kneeling down to her level. "Ms. Martinez will be your teacher every day." As Mrs. Patterson returned to collect them for the official tour, Chloe did something that stopped everyone in their tracks. She wrapped her small arms around Clara's legs in a fierce hug. "Thank you for reading to me," she whispered against Clara's apron. Clara's eyes filled with tears. She quickly blinked away. "It was my absolute pleasure, Chloe. I can't wait to read more stories with you." Walking to his car afterward, Ethan's mind was racing. The woman who'd captivated him at dinner, who'd made him laugh and forget about quarterly reports and board meetings, was his daughter's teacher. The same woman who'd somehow, in 20 minutes, accomplished what months of therapy had failed to do, make Chloe excited about something again. But as he strapped Chloe into her car seat, reality began creeping in. Dating his daughter's teacher would be complicated, potentially problematic. Clara's job could be at risk. His carefully controlled life could become messier than he'd ever allowed it to be. Yet as he drove away from Sunshine Preschool, stealing glances at Chloe's genuinely happy face in the rearview mirror, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, messy might be exactly what they both needed. And back in her classroom, Clara was discovering that sometimes the most unexpected encounters happen in the most familiar places, bringing possibilities she'd never dared to imagine. There's something particularly vicious about small communities when they catch the scent of scandal. It's like watching sharks circle blood in the water, slow at first, then frenzied, then utterly destructive. Clara had always loved the tight-knit feeling of her neighborhood, the way everyone knew everyone else's business in that warm, caring way that made you feel safe and connected. But she was about to learn that the same intimacy that could comfort you could also completely destroy you. It started innocuously enough. Chloe had been at Sunshine Preschool for 2 weeks, and the transformation was remarkable. The quiet, withdrawn little girl was blooming under Clara's patient attention. She participated in circle time, played gently with other children, and had started bringing Clara little drawings every morning, crooked flowers and stick figure families that Clara treasured like fine art. Ethan's daily pickups had become the highlight of Clara's day, though she'd never admit it out loud. Their conversations were brief, professional, focused on Chloe's progress. But there were moments when their hands accidentally brushed as she handed him Chloe's backpack, when their eyes met across the playground during outdoor time, when he lingered just a bit too long asking about her day. That made Clara's heart race with possibilities she knew she shouldn't entertain. What Clara didn't notice, but what every other parent at pickup absolutely did notice, was that Ethan Cole's car was unlike anything that had ever pulled up to Sunshine Preschool. The sleek black Bentley stood out among the minivans and SUVs like a diamond in a parking lot full of pebbles. And when Ethan himself stepped out, tall, impeccably dressed, radiating the kind of confidence that only came with serious wealth, every conversation stopped mid-sentence. Sarah Henderson was the first to do the math. She'd seen Ethan's face on the business section of the newspaper often enough to recognize him immediately. "Do you know who that is?" She whispered urgently to the cluster of moms waiting by the playground gate. "That's Ethan Cole, the Ethan Cole. He's worth like billions." The whispers spread like wildfire. By the end of the week, every parent at Sunshine Preschool knew that little Chloe's father was one of the most powerful CEOs in the city. More importantly, they'd all noticed how he seemed to light up whenever he talked to Clara Martinez, and how she blushed prettily whenever he was around. Rebecca Martinez, no relation to Clara despite the shared last name, was particularly observant. "Have you seen how she acts around him? All giggly and nervous. And did you notice how long their conversations are getting? Yesterday they talked for like 15 minutes about Chloe's adjustment. Please. That child is fine. She's clearly making moves." The gossip might have stayed contained to the preschool parent network if it weren't for Jessica. Clara's former friend had been seething ever since the blind date disaster, embarrassed by how spectacularly her cruel joke had backfired. When she heard through her network, because mean girls always have networks, that Clara was somehow connected to Ethan Cole, her humiliation transformed into something much more dangerous: vindictive jealousy. Jessica wasted no time calling everyone she knew. "You'll never believe what Clara Martinez is up to now," she'd begin each conversation with barely contained glee. "Remember that pathetic blind date thing? Well, turns out she's working some angle with that billionaire CEO. She's his daughter's teacher, and apparently she's really playing up the whole caring educator thing to get her hooks into him. The story grew more twisted with each retelling. Clara went from being a dedicated teacher who cared about her student to a calculating gold digger who deliberately targeted a vulnerable widower through his child. The narrative was particularly cruel because it took Clara's greatest strength, her genuine love for children, and turned it into something manipulative and self-serving. By the third week, the whispers had reached beyond the preschool. Local social media groups picked up the story. Photos of Ethan's car in the Sunshine preschool parking lot began circulating. Someone even managed to snap a picture of Clara and Ethan talking by the playground fence, Chloe between them, all three of them smiling. Out of context, it looked like exactly what the gossips claimed: a woman making calculated moves on a wealthy man. The comments were brutal. "Gold digger alert!" Using an innocent child to get to the father. These women have no shame. Someone should report her to the school board. Clara remained blissfully unaware of the online storm brewing around her, but she couldn't ignore the changed atmosphere at work. Parents who had previously greeted her warmly now offered tight smiles and quick nods. Conversation stopped when she entered the teacher's lounge. Mrs. Patterson called her into the office for informal chats that felt increasingly like interrogations disguised as concern. "Clara, dear," Mrs. Patterson said during one particularly uncomfortable meeting, "I've been hearing some mud talk about you and Mr. Cole. I'm sure it's nothing, but we do need to maintain professional boundaries with our families." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. Professional boundaries? She'd done nothing but be kind to a child and polite to her father. The injustice of it burned in her chest, but what could she say? That she'd been thinking about Ethan more than she should? That she looked forward to their brief conversations more than any part of her day? That she'd started taking extra care with her appearance on mornings when she knew he'd be there? The breaking point came on a Thursday afternoon. Clara was helping Chloe with her jacket when she overheard two mothers talking near the cubby area. They weren't even trying to lower their voices. "I heard she actually showed up to some fancy restaurant trying to meet him before he enrolled his daughter here," one of them said. "Like she was actively hunting him." "That's so predatory," the other replied. "Using that poor little girl. The child just lost her mother, and this woman is trying to replace her just for money." Clara's hands stilled on Chloe's zipper. The story they were telling, her humiliating blind date night, had been completely twisted. In this version, she hadn't been the victim of a cruel joke. She'd been the aggressor, the predator, the woman so desperate for wealth that she'd target a grieving widower through his vulnerable child. Chloe looked up at her with those perceptive 4-year-old eyes and whispered, "Ms. Clara, why do you look sad?" That evening, Clara stared at herself in her bathroom mirror, trying to recognize the woman looking back at her. 3 weeks ago, she'd been invisible, overlooked, ignored, but safe in her anonymity. Now she was the center of attention she'd never wanted, painted as a villain in a story she didn't even understand. When her phone buzzed with a text from Ethan asking if everything was okay because Chloe had mentioned she seemed upset, Clara felt her heart break a little more. Even reaching out to check on her well-being could be twisted into evidence of inappropriate involvement. She typed and deleted a dozen responses before settling on something safe and professional. But as she hit send, Clara realized that safe and professional might not be enough anymore. The gossip machine had already decided who she was, and the truth seemed completely irrelevant to the story they were telling. And somewhere across town, Ethan was about to discover that when you're worth billions, everyone assumes they know your motivations, including the motivations of anyone who gets close to you. You know that moment when someone you care about is drowning, and you suddenly realize you're the only one who can throw them a lifeline? That's exactly where Ethan Cole found himself on a Friday morning that would change everything. He'd built his empire by being 3 steps ahead of everyone else, by anticipating problems before they became disasters. But somehow he'd missed the tsunami building around the woman who'd become the most important person in his life. The wake-up call came from an unexpected source. Ethan was reviewing quarterly projections when his assistant, Patricia, knocked on his office door with an expression he'd never seen before. Part concern, part anger, and entirely protective. Patricia had been with Cole Industries for 15 years, and she'd never once brought personal matters into his business hours. "Mr. Cole," she said carefully, I think there's something you need to see. She placed her tablet on his mahogany desk, and what Ethan saw made his blood run cold. Social media posts, local news blog articles, comment threads that went on for pages, all centered around Clara Martinez and her alleged gold-digging schemes targeting grieving widowers through their vulnerable children. The photos were the worst part. Someone had taken pictures of him talking to Clara at school pickup, images that captured private moments of connection and twisted them into evidence of manipulation. There was Clara laughing at something he'd said, but the caption read, "Local teacher works her charm on billionaire CEO." There was Chloe holding Clara's hand during a field day, described as using an innocent child as bait. But it was the comments that made Ethan's hands shake with fury. Hundreds of strangers dissecting Clara's character, her motives, her worth as a human being. They called her pathetic, desperate, calculating. They questioned her qualifications as a teacher. They suggested she should be fired, investigated, publicly shamed for daring to exist in the same space as wealth. How long has this been going on? Ethan's voice was deadly quiet, the tone his board members had learned to fear during hostile takeover meetings. "About a week," Patricia replied. "It's spreading fast. Local parent groups, neighborhood forums, even some of the business networks are picking it up. Someone leaked that you've been having longer conversations with her at pickup." Ethan scrolled through more posts, each one making him sicker than the last. These people didn't know Clara. They'd never seen her patience with a struggling child, never watched her stay late to prepare special activities for kids who needed extra attention, never witnessed her genuine joy when one of her students achieved a breakthrough. They'd taken the most caring, selfless person he'd ever met and turned her into a caricature of greed and manipulation. The irony was devastating. Clara, who'd tried so hard to maintain professional boundaries that their conversations had become almost painfully formal, was being crucified for an inappropriate relationship that existed only in the gossip's imaginations. Clara, who'd been pulling away from him for weeks now, he could see it in her careful politeness, feel it in the way she avoided his eyes, was being painted as an aggressive pursuer. "Sir?" Patricia's voice brought him back to the moment. "There's more. I've been monitoring the school district's social media. Parents are demanding she be investigated, possibly terminated. The pressure is building." That's when it hit him like a freight train. Clara wasn't just being humiliated. Her career, her livelihood, her entire future was at stake. Because of him? Because she'd been kind to his daughter. Because he'd been selfish enough to enjoy their brief conversations without considering how it might look to others. Ethan stood up abruptly, his mind already racing through possibilities. He could have his legal team issue cease and desist orders, but that would only add fuel to the fire. He could try to distance himself from the situation, but that would leave Clara to face the wolves alone. Or he could do what every instinct in his business-trained mind told him not to do. He could make it personal, public, and irreversibly real. "Patricia, cancel all my meetings for today. I need you to arrange an emergency press conference." His assistant's eyebrows shot up. "Sir? A press conference about what exactly?" "About setting the record straight." Ethan was already reaching for his phone. "And Patricia, make sure every major news outlet in the city gets an invitation. This isn't going to be a quiet affair." Within 4 hours, the main conference room at Cole Industries was packed with reporters, cameras, and enough media attention to make a presidential announcement look modest. Ethan had faced hostile press conferences before. During the merger scandals, the environmental lawsuits, the corporate restructuring that had cost hundreds of jobs. But he'd never walked into one knowing that his words would irrevocably change not just his life, but the life of someone he'd come to care about more than he'd thought possible. The questions started immediately, aggressive and probing. Reporters had done their homework, connecting the dots between the social media speculation and his presence at Sunshine Preschool. They wanted to know about his relationship with Clara, about whether there were ethical concerns, about how this might affect his daughter. Ethan let them talk, watching the red lights on the cameras, knowing that every word he spoke would be broadcast across the city within minutes. When the room finally quieted, he stepped closer to the podium, his voice steady and clear. "I called this press conference to address the malicious rumors circulating about Ms. Clara Martinez, my daughter's preschool teacher." The room went completely silent. For the past week, I've watched a good woman be torn apart by gossip, speculation, and outright lies. I've watched her professional reputation be destroyed by people who've never met her, who know nothing about her character or her dedication to the children she serves. He paused, letting his words sink in. Let me be absolutely clear about something. Ms. Martinez did not pursue me. She has never acted inappropriately. She has never been anything other than completely professional in every interaction we've had. The suggestion that she would use a child, my child, to advance some personal agenda is not only false, it's insulting to everything she stands for as an educator. The reporters were frantically scribbling notes, cameras flashing, but Ethan continued, his voice growing stronger and more passionate with each word. The truth is this. Clara Martinez saved my daughter. When Chloe started at Sunshine Preschool, she was withdrawn, struggling to connect with anyone after losing her mother. Within days of being in Ms. Martinez's classroom, my daughter was smiling again, engaging with other children, excited about learning. That transformation happened because Ms. Martinez cared enough to see past Chloe's walls and reach the little girl inside. Ethan's hands gripped the podium edge. And if I'm being completely honest with all of you, Clara Martinez saved me too. She reminded me what it looks like when someone cares about what they do, when someone puts children first, when someone's heart is bigger than their ambition. She never needed my money or my connections or my influence. If anything, knowing me has made her life more difficult, more complicated, more painful. The room was so quiet you could hear cameras clicking, pens scratching against paper. Ethan took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would cross a line he could never uncross. So let me end the speculation once and for all. Clara Martinez isn't pursuing me. I'm pursuing her. She hasn't been trying to get close to my family. I've been trying to convince her that maybe, just maybe, she could become part of it. The explosion of questions was immediate, but Ethan held up his hand for silence. I'm not taking questions about my personal life. I'm simply asking that you show the same respect for Ms. Martinez that you would want for your own daughters, your own sisters, your own mothers. Judge her by her actions, not by gossip. Look at the children whose lives she's touched, the families she's helped, the difference she makes every single day. He stepped back from the podium, but not before delivering the line that would be quoted in every news report for the next week. Clara Martinez doesn't need me, but I definitely need her. As Ethan walked out of that conference room, he knew there was no going back. He'd just declared his intentions to the entire city, put Clara in an impossible position, and guaranteed that their quiet, careful dance around each other was over. But sometimes the biggest risks lead to the most extraordinary possibilities. Sometimes the most transformative moments of your life happen when you least expect them, in places where fairy tales feel impossible but somehow unfold anyway. That's exactly what happened on the night that would forever divide Clara's life into before and everything after. The press conference had changed everything overnight. Clara woke up Saturday morning to find her phone buzzing with hundreds of notifications. Friend requests, messages from reporters, calls from people she hadn't spoken to in years. The story had gone viral in ways she never could have imagined. Claragate was trending on social media, but this time, the narrative had completely flipped. Ethan's public declaration hadn't just defended her. It had transformed her from the villain of the story into its unlikely heroine. Suddenly, everyone wanted to know about the preschool teacher who'd captured the heart of one of the city's most powerful men. The same people who'd been calling her a gold digger 24 hours earlier were now praising her for her dedication, her authenticity, her ability to see past wealth to the man and child underneath. But Clara wasn't thinking about social media or public perception when Ethan called her that evening. She was thinking about how his voice sounded different, more vulnerable, more uncertain than she'd ever heard it. "Clara," he said, and just the way he spoke her name made her heart skip. "I owe you the biggest apology of my life. What I did today, putting you in that position without asking, making your private business public, I had no right. You were protecting me," Clara replied softly, standing in her small kitchen while outside her apartment. News vans had been circling for hours. "And Chloe, you were protecting both of us." "No," Ethan's voice was firm. "I was being selfish. I couldn't stand watching you get torn apart for something that was never your fault. But I should have asked you first. I should have considered what you wanted, what would be best for your career, your life." What Clara wanted to tell him, what she'd been wanting to tell him for weeks but had been too scared. too aware of all the complications, was that she'd been falling for him since their first real conversation. Not because of his wealth or power, but because of the way he looked at his daughter like she was the most precious thing in the world. Because of how he remembered that she'd mentioned loving rainy days, and how he'd started bringing Chloe a few minutes early on cloudy mornings just so they could talk while she set up her classroom. Instead, she found herself saying, "Ethan, there's something you should know. About that night at the restaurant, our first meeting. It wasn't really a blind date." She told him everything then, about Jessica's cruel joke, about sitting alone while her so-called friends filmed her humiliation, about how his intervention had saved her from one of the worst nights of her life. When she finished, the silence on the other end of the line stretched so long she wondered if he'd hung up. "Clara," he finally said, and his voice was thick with emotion. "I had no idea. God, what kind of people would do something like that to you?" "The kind of people who don't see others as fully human," she replied, surprised by her own wisdom. "But you know what? If they hadn't done it, we never would have met. And meeting Chloe, it's been the best thing that's happened to me in years." That's when Ethan made a decision that surprised even him. "Clara, I need to see you. There's something I want to ask you and I can't do it over the phone." An hour later, Clara found herself in the back of Ethan's car, heading toward downtown for what he'd mysteriously called the annual Coal Industries Charity Gala. She'd protested that she wasn't dressed for such an event, but Ethan had insisted. She looked perfect just as she was, in a simple, black dress she'd owned for 3 years and the same pearl earrings her grandmother had left her. The gala was unlike anything Clara had ever experienced. The ballroom was filled with the city's elite, politicians, celebrities, business moguls who appeared regularly on magazine covers. Crystal chandeliers cast everything in warm gold light, and the champagne probably cost more per bottle than Clara spent on groceries in a month. But what struck her most was how different Ethan seemed in this environment. This was his world, where he commanded respect with a simple nod, where conversations paused when he entered a room. Yet throughout the evening, he kept his hand gently on the small of her back, introducing her to everyone not as Chloe's teacher, but simply as Clara, who means everything to me and my daughter. The auction portion of the evening raised hundreds of thousands for children's charities. Clara watched in amazement as people bid ridiculous amounts on vacation packages and art pieces, but she was most touched when Ethan won a bid for a year of art supplies for underfunded preschools, a donation he'd clearly arranged specifically for her students. As the evening began winding down, Clara expected they'd head home. Instead, Ethan led her to the stage where he'd been scheduled to give closing remarks about the evening's charitable success. But when he took the microphone, his words had nothing to do with fundraising totals or corporate giving. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice carried clearly across the suddenly quiet ballroom. "Most of you know me as a businessman, a CEO, someone who deals in facts and figures and strategic planning. But tonight I want to talk to you about something that can't be quantified or strategized. Love." Clara's heart stopped. Around them, 500 of the city's most powerful people had gone completely silent, sensing they were about to witness something extraordinary. 3 months ago, I thought I knew what my life looked like. I had my work, my daughter, and a carefully controlled routine that kept us both safe and predictable. Then I met a woman who changed everything. Ethan's eyes found Clara's in the crowd, and she felt like they were the only two people in the world. She didn't care about my money or my connections. She cared about my daughter. She saw past Chloe's walls to the amazing little girl inside, and she helped me see that maybe our carefully controlled life was missing something essential: joy. The crowd was completely captivated now, understanding they were witnessing something unprecedented. Ethan Cole, known for his privacy and professional demeanor, was opening his heart in front of everyone. "Clara Martinez," he continued, and to Clara's shock, he was walking down from the stage, moving through the crowd toward her. "You've taught me that the best things in life aren't planned or strategized. They're felt. They're risked. They're chosen again and again, even when it's scary, even when it's complicated, even when the whole world is watching." By the time he reached her, Clara was crying and didn't care who saw. The crowd had formed a circle around them, but she could barely see anyone except Ethan, who was now dropping to one knee in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, pulling a ring box from his jacket pocket. "I'm not asking you to marry my money or my status or my complications," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the silent ballroom. "I'm asking you to marry me. The man who's learned what love actually looks like by watching you love my daughter. The man who wants to wake up every morning knowing that you're part of our family. Officially and forever." The ring was stunning but not ostentatious. A classic solitaire that somehow perfectly captured Clara's simple elegance. But what made her breath catch wasn't the diamond. It was the way Ethan was looking at her. Like she was the answer to every question he'd never known he was asking. "Clara Martinez," he said, his voice barely above a whisper but somehow audible to everyone in the room. "Will you marry me?" Through her tears, Clara could see the hope and vulnerability in his eyes, could feel the weight of 500 people holding their breath, could sense that her answer would change not just their lives, but become part of a story people would tell for years to come. But in that moment, none of that mattered. What mattered was the man kneeling in front of her, the little girl who would become her daughter, and the family they were choosing to build together. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes. Ethan, yes to all of it." The ballroom erupted in applause as he slipped the ring onto her finger and pulled her into a kiss that felt like coming home. And somewhere in the crowd, people were already reaching for their phones, ready to share the news that would make headlines across the country. The billionaire CEO and the preschool teacher who'd found love in the most unexpected places. But Clara barely noticed the cameras or the cheering. She was too busy falling into the arms of the man who'd just made her the happiest woman in the world. There's something magical about endings that are actually beginnings, about moments when everything you thought you knew about your life gets rewritten into something more beautiful than you ever dared to imagine. That's exactly what Clara discovered 6 months later, standing in a sun-drenched garden surrounded by the people who mattered most, about to become Mrs. Ethan Cole. The media had expected a spectacle, the kind of wedding that would grace magazine covers and social media feeds for months. After all, when a billionaire CEO marries the preschool teacher who captured his heart, the world assumes it'll be an event worthy of royalty. The guest list that gossip columnists speculated about included Hollywood celebrities, political figures, and business titans who could buy small countries. But Clara and Ethan had learned something important during their whirlwind engagement. The most precious moments happen when you stop performing for others and start living for yourself. So instead of the grand cathedral ceremony everyone expected, they chose the garden behind Ethan's home, the same space where Chloe had taken her first steps after her mother's death, where she'd learned to ride her bike, where she'd built fairy houses among the roses. The guest list was small but meaningful. Clara's parents, who'd flown in from their small hometown with tears of joy, and barely contained amazement at how their daughter's life had transformed. Ethan's business partners and closest friends, people who'd watched him navigate single fatherhood and never expected to see him this happy again. The teachers from Sunshine Preschool, because Clara insisted that the people who'd supported her through the worst gossip should be there to celebrate the best day. And of course, there was Chloe, absolutely radiant in a flower girl dress she'd picked out herself, soft pink with tiny embroidered butterflies, because as she'd explained seriously to the sales clerk, butterflies mean new beginnings, and Clara is our new beginning. The ceremony itself was simple but profound. Clara walked down the garden path not to dramatic organ music, but to Chloe's favorite lullaby played softly on guitar. She'd chosen a dress that was elegant but not overwhelming, flowing ivory silk that moved like poetry in the gentle breeze, because she wanted to look like herself, just the very best version. When the officiant asked for the rings, Chloe stepped forward with the solemnity of someone entrusted with the most important job in the world. But what made everyone tear up wasn't just her careful handling of the wedding bands. It was the moment when she looked up at Clara and whispered loud enough for everyone to hear, "Now you'll really be my mommy." Ethan's vows were nothing like the polished business presentations he was known for. His voice cracked when he talked about how Clara had taught him that love wasn't about control or strategy, but about trust and vulnerability and choosing each other every single day. He promised to support her dreams, to value her independence, to remember that she'd chosen him not for what he could provide, but for who he was when everything else was stripped away. Clara's vows were written on her heart rather than on paper. She talked about how Ethan and Chloe had shown her that family wasn't just about blood relations, but about people who saw your true worth even when the world tried to tear you down. She promised to love Chloe not as a stepmother trying to replace someone irreplaceable, but as another person who would always have the little girl's back. She promised to love Ethan not despite his complicated life, but because of his strength, his devotion, his ability to choose love even when it was risky. The reception was held right there in the garden, with string lights twinkling overhead and tables set among the flower beds. The food was provided by the local Italian restaurant where Ethan had taken Clara for their first real date. Not because it was fancy, but because it was where they'd learned they could talk for hours without running out of things to say. During the father-daughter dance, something beautiful happened. Halfway through the song, Chloe tugged on Ethan's suit jacket and whispered something in his ear. He smiled, nodded, and walked her over to Clara. She says this should be a family dance, he explained. And suddenly Clara was swaying in the garden with her new husband and daughter, feeling more complete than she'd ever imagined possible. Later, as the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Clara found herself standing at the edge of the garden with Mrs. Patterson, her former director who'd become a dear friend despite the rocky period during the gossip storm. You know, Mrs. Patterson said thoughtfully, I've been in education for 30 years, and I've never seen a love story quite like yours. Not just between you and Ethan, but between you and Chloe. That little girl has bloomed in ways her father never expected. Clara looked across the garden where Ethan was helping Chloe collect flower, petals in a small basket, a treasure hunt she'd insisted on organizing herself. I think we all bloomed, she replied softly. Sometimes it takes the right conditions for people to become who they're meant to be. As the last guest departed and the garden grew quiet, the three of them sat together on the porch swing that had become their evening tradition. Chloe was curled between them, fighting sleep but too excited about her new family to give in just yet. Are you happy, sweetheart? Ethan asked his daughter, stroking her hair gently. Chloe nodded sleepily, then looked up at Clara with those wise 4-year-old eyes that had seen too much loss but had learned to recognize love when it appeared. Clara, she said softly, thank you for staying when people were being mean. Daddy told me you could have left, but you didn't. Clara's heart swelled with so much love she thought it might burst. Baby girl, she replied, I would never leave you. You're stuck with me forever now. Good, Chloe murmured, finally succumbing to sleep. Forever is exactly how long I wanted. As they sat there in the gathering darkness, Clara thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. The cruel joke that had led to an unexpected rescue. The gossip that had threatened to destroy her reputation, but had ultimately revealed what really mattered. The public scrutiny that had forced them to define their relationship on their own terms. Every challenge had been worth it for this. For the feeling of belonging somewhere completely. For the joy of watching a wounded little girl learn to trust again. For the deep satisfaction of building something beautiful with someone who valued her heart more than any external measure of worth. Ethan's voice broke into her thoughts. Any regrets, Mrs. Cole? Clara considered the question seriously. 6 months ago, she'd been a single preschool teacher living a quiet, predictable life. Now she was married to one of the most powerful men in the city, stepmother to an extraordinary little girl, and thrust into a level of public attention she'd never wanted. But as she looked at her sleeping daughter and felt Ethan's arm tighten around her shoulders, Clara knew with absolute certainty that every twist and turn had led them exactly where they needed to be. Not a single one. She whispered, and meant every word. And that's how Clara Martinez went from being the victim of a cruel joke to becoming the wife of a billionaire CEO. Not because she was chasing wealth, but because she had something money can't buy, a genuine heart that recognized love in its purest form. Think about it for a moment. How many times have you let other people's opinions stop you from living your truth? How many opportunities have you missed because you were afraid of what the gossips would say? Clara could have hidden away after that humiliating blind date. She could have quit her job when the rumors started flying. She could have pushed Ethan away to protect herself from the scrutiny. But she didn't. She chose to stay authentic, to keep showing up, to let her actions speak louder than the noise around her. And that choice, that refusal to let cruelty define her worth, changed everything. Here's what I want you to remember from Clara's story. Your value isn't determined by what others think of you. Your worth isn't measured by your bank account, your designer clothes, or your social media followers. Real love recognizes real character, period. And when you stay true to who you are, even when it's difficult, even when people are tearing you down, you attract the kind of people who see your heart for what it really is. So here's my challenge for you. What dream have you been putting off because you're worried about what people will think? What opportunity have you been avoiding because it feels too good to be true? What version of yourself have you been hiding because you're afraid of judgment? Clara's story proves that sometimes the most beautiful chapters of our lives begin when we stop trying to please everyone else and start honoring who we really are. Your fairy tale might not involve a billionaire CEO, but it definitely involves you being brave enough to believe you deserve extraordinary love, genuine respect, and authentic happiness. The question is, are you ready to stop playing small and start living the story you actually want to tell? If you're ready to transform your life and stop letting others define your worth, then subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell. Every week we share incredible stories of people who refused to settle, who chose courage over comfort, and who discovered that their greatest challenges became their most beautiful victories. Don't just be a passive observer of these transformations. Become part of a community that believes in extraordinary possibilities. Click that subscribe button, activate those notifications, and join thousands of others who are rewriting their stories and claiming the life they deserve. Your extraordinary is waiting for you to claim it, and we're here to remind you of that every single week. Subscribe now and never miss another story that could change your perspective forever. Don't let this be just another story you watched. Let it be the reminder that changes how you show up in your own life.